In this section, we'll look at the situation for African Americans and immigrants and women during the 1920s. Not surprisingly, given the heyday of the Klan, it wasn't a very good period for African Americans. There was a dramatic rise in the number of lynchings and kidnappings and floggings that kind of paralleled the growth of the Klan. Most people in the Klan weren't violent, but there were some who were, and the Imperial Klan headquarters didn't really exert much control over the individual Klaverns, which tended to vary from community to community, and some were quite violent. Reacting to this was the NAACP, the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, which tried to pass a new lynching bill. It passed the House, actually 230 to 119, but it fell victim to a Southern filibuster in the Senate. The NAACP also published a book documenting all the atrocities against African Americans. In the 1920s, some African Americans responded by forming a movement to get African Americans to return to Africa. The movement in the United States was led by Marcus Garvey. Returning to Africa wasn't a novel idea. You may know that in the 1840s and 1850s, a number of whites who were hoping to avoid a civil war had formed the American Colonization Society, which would intended to pay for the return of slaves back to Africa. Actually, Abraham Lincoln had supported this, but it never got wide support. The difference this time was it was run by an African American. It was an African American movement. Garvey formed the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He had begun it in his native Jamaica in 1914, and it spread to New York 2 years later. What Garvey hoped to accomplish wasn't just to get African Americans to go back to Africa. He hoped to get all Africans who had spread throughout the world as part of the centuries-long African diaspora to return to Africa and unite. And if they did so, they would be a true superpower, Garvey believed. So it was a pan-African movement. That's what the Universal Negro Improvement Association hoped to accomplish. The UNIA grew quickly. Its membership approached almost 500,000, and Garvey helped form tried to form a steamship company to take African Americans back to Africa. They called it the Black Star Line. It was a play on the famous ocean liner company, the White Star Line. Garvey focused first on moving African Americans to Liberia and West Africa, but what Garvey found out was that he had some real problems. First of all, the Liberian government didn't welcome him. They didn't see African Americans returning to Africa as brothers coming home, but rather as Americans coming in to run the show. So the actual Liberian government wouldn't work with Garvey. Moreover, the African Americans themselves didn't want to go back to Africa because they didn't seem like home to them. They had been born, their family had been born in the United States, and they planned to stay. Faced with such resistance, Garvey decided that he was going to conquer Africa, and he formed a Universal African Legion and proclaimed himself President of the Empire of Africa. Not surprisingly, this attempt was kind of doomed as well. He was ultimately imprisoned for mail fraud and deported back to Jamaica, and his movement ended up dying out. Unlike Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, who both argued for integration in the United States for African Americans, albeit with different strategies, Garvey said that African Americans would never have equality. Well, there turns out there was one bright spot for African Americans in the 1920s, and it was with the Ford Motor Company. Undoubtedly to try to undercut his prices for labor, but nevertheless, the Ford Motor Company did employ blacks and integrate their factory workforce. In 1923, Ford employed 5,000 blacks, and 3 years later, in 1926, it employed 10,000. And although the blacks tended to be concentrated in jobs that the whites didn't want, there were still some skilled workers at Ford, some black skilled workers at Ford, and even some black foremen of mixed race crews. Ford actually developed a personnel policy that tried to strengthen the loyalty of blacks. It kept contacts with black leaders, like in the clergy, and gave money to some of the black charities. When it came to immigrants, it also, not surprisingly, wasn't a 1920s weren't a pleasant period for immigrants as well. The Ku Klux Klan, you recall, not only went after African Americans but the immigrants. The problem again was that the immigrants who had been arriving were from Eastern and Southern Europe, and they weren't WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They didn't assimilate readily, and you begin to see a movement in the United States to try to restrict immigration. And this is going to ultimately culminate in the Immigration Act of 1921, which Warren Harding signed. And what that did was it limited the number of immigrants to 3% of the various foreign-born elements living in the United States in 1910. And as you can see in this graph here, the number of immigrants dramatically and suddenly decreased. If this wasn't enough, 3 years later, Congress even strengthened the anti-immigration legislation with the National Origins Act of 1924, which was harsher but also more implicitly racist. It limited immigration to only 2% of the foreign-born elements living in the United States by 1890. But the key was this 1890 was before the real wave of Southern and Eastern European immigrants had begun to arrive. It wasn't just that date wasn't just selected randomly. So as it was applied, let's say we're in the mid-1920s after this legislation passes, and somebody comes from, say, Great Britain. Well, in 1890, there were a lot of people from Great Britain living in the United States, and 2% of that number would be quite a large number of people. But if somebody came from, say, Bulgaria or Poland or Eastern Europe, and they came in the mid-1920s, you would find that there weren't many people from those countries living in the United States in 1990. So the 2% of that number wouldn't be much at all. And the end effect would be that a lot more people could get in from Northern and Western Europe in the mid-1920s after the National Origins Act of 24. It was legislation that was implicitly racist. When it came to women, you do see some remnants of the activism of the suffrage movement, despite the 19th Amendment passing. Early in the 20s, you see passage of legislation that reflected some of the concerns of the new female voting constituency. The Shepard-Towner Act, signed in 1921 by Harding, did allocate some federal funds to create maternity and pediatric clinics. And the government created a women's bureau in the U.S. Department of Labor because it anticipated more female workers. After the early 1920s, the women's movement really sort of began to wither. The 19th Amendment had been a big culmination and lost some of its enthusiasm. What picked it back up was late in the 1920s proposals for an Equal Rights Amendment, or an ERA. The principle was simple. It was that all laws, state, local, and national, had to treat both genders equally. And the reason was there were a number of laws across the country that were unfair. For example, in some states, a husband could divorce the wife if she had sex before marriage, but the wife couldn't divorce the husband if he had. A man whose wife was guilty of adultery could sue his wife's lover, but the wife couldn't do the same in a similar situation. Women sometimes were denied the right to make contracts, to hold earnings without their husband's consent, or to serve on jurors. So the ERA was attempted to address these inequities. The author of the ERA and the person who really pushed it was the old suffragette Alice Paul, only she wasn't really old at this point. She was young, and she continued to introduce ERA in every session of Congress until she died in the 1970s, and you can see her obituary over there on the right. This concludes the section on African Americans, immigrants, and women.